Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa. For this week's episode, I spoke with photographer Drew Nikonowicz. Drew is currently completing his BFA at the University of Missouri, but don't let his youth fool you. Drew's work has been exhibited both nationally and internationally, and in 2015 he won both the Lens Scratch Student Prize and the Aperture Portfolio Prize. I got a chance to see him give a lecture at the Medium Festival of Photography here in San Diego back in October, where he talked about his series This World and Others Like It. And the talk turned out to be sort of controversial, at least as far as the range of reactions it provoked in the audience. During the Q&A, he got both applause and, in some cases, downright hostility. So, what was it that bothered people so much about his work? Well, I'm going to read you the artist statement that goes along with that series. This World and Others Like It investigates the role of the 21st century explorer by combining computer modeling with analog photographic processes. Drawing upon the language of 19th century survey images, I question their relationship with current methods of record making. Thousands of explorable realities exist through rover and probe-based imagery, virtual role-playing, and video game software. Within the contemporary wilderness, robots have replaced photographers as mediators, producing images completely dislocated from human experience. This suggests that now the sublime landscape is only accessible through the boundaries of technology. It's that last line that really got people going, and I think you can see why it's a provocative statement. Drew and I talked about that during our conversation here, so you'll hear more about that in a bit. I'm also putting a link in the show notes to a recording Drew made of his lecture. It's about 55 minutes, including the Q&A, and if you get a chance, I definitely recommend giving it a listen. One other thing I'd like to touch on is something that came up in my chat with Drew, and that's the idea of indexicality. Now, I know that's a $3 word, but basically the idea here when it comes to photography is that a photograph is a pointer, that at least initially every photograph is a reference to something that was in front of the camera. And of course, there are cameraless techniques and all kinds of digital manipulations you can do to get away from representative photography. But when you come down to it, this idea of indexicality has a lot to do with how we understand photographs. Now, a lot of photographers and philosophers have argued that there is a huge difference between a photograph and the thing depicted in the photograph. And actually, that's not even an idea limited to just photography. I mean, Magritte had his "This is not a pipe" painting. But anyway, in a really literal sense, that's true. The photograph isn't the same as the thing. But even though it's true, I kind of feel like it's a hand wave, you know? Like, noticing the difference doesn't really get you very far in understanding how photographs work, because so much of how we understand images has to do with context. And for anyone who's grown up around cameras, we have an understanding of the fact that you point a camera at a thing and take a picture. So even with fairly abstract photography, that knowledge of photographs as references colors how you see the picture. In fact, I'd say that this is particularly the case with abstract work because the requirement of the camera to record something from the world is what separates photography from a more constructive medium like painting. I should say, yes, I do know there's photography out there that's conceptually looking at the ways photographs are not the same as the photographic subject. Chris Egman comes to mind immediately. And I'm not saying this isn't an interesting thing to work with. I love Chris Egman's work. Even there, though, I'd say that the context of indexicality is still vital to the way you understand it. And that's definitely true with Drew's work here, which is explicitly looking at technologically mediated experiences. But this is a pretty big topic, and so rather than continue harping on, I'll just leave it there. And if you have any comments, please write in and let me know what you're thinking. podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. Okay, so back to Drew Nikonowicz. I've put a link in the show notes to his portfolio site where you can see the images from This World and Others Like It, so definitely check that out. And now, here's my conversation with Drew. So when did you get back from New York? Your show was last month, is that right?
Yeah, let me look at a calendar. I was in New York from around the 18th. No, that doesn't sound right. It was the 12th to the 18th. I'm
Okay.
almost certain.
Okay. How
So,
how was your show? Congratulations, by the way.
thank you. It was really great. I mean, so my plan was maybe it was the 10th to the 18th. It doesn't matter. I got there on a Thursday. Let's just go with that. And it was in December. And so the plan was to go in on Thursday because the opening was Saturday and I was going to help them install the work. But by the time I had gotten to New York and made my way over to the foundation, they were like halfway done installing it. And I was like, oh, okay, this is great. And I think they were like surprised by my level. I'm not sure how I was incredibly impressed that they were like that far along. And I didn't mean it as like a slight. I'm not sure how they felt about my response. I'm sure they didn't take it poorly, but that's just like, part of their job, and so they're so used to installing work. But like, there's not a lot of that in Missouri, and so
Right.
I was just like, "Damn, you're already this far along," and they're like, "Yeah, we stamped it out, we stamped it out," and I was like, "Okay, I mean, I'm really impressed." But that was really great. And then the opening was fantastic. A bunch of people came out, and it coincided with their holiday book bazaar, and so that like brought a ton of attention to the other side of the gallery. And then at a certain point, all of those people sort of shuffled over to the other side of the gallery where my work was at, and it was just really good. I mean, most of the opening I actually spent talking to like friends of mine because interestingly enough, like a bunch of people from Missouri found their way to New York, and so being friends with me, I was like inviting them all out. So I just like that was a good time because I just got to hang out and chat with them. But earlier in the day, I'd done a walkthrough, and at that point, I was talking to all strangers and people I hadn't met. So it was really just like 10 plus hours straight of just like hanging out at Aperture and talking to people, and it was just like a really fantastic time. I had an amazing time, and by the end of the day I was so tired. I like immediately took my dress shoes off and put some sneakers on and walked back to my hotel, got dinner, and then went to bed. I was exhausted.
I can imagine.
So
But how was the response from people? How did that go?
it was really good. And maybe it was like part of, I don't know. I mean, you were there in San Diego,
Right.
and so there was like a very distinct division in the room,
Uh-huh.
which I actually really enjoyed, just because it meant that there was like a lot of conversation happening. But there was less of that in New York, not in a bad way. It was all just like much more positive constantly, as opposed to people sort of like, not being angry, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that has to do with sort of the cultural differences between Southern California and New York. New York being, I mean, everybody, thinks of New York as being a particularly sophisticated place as audiences go. Not to say that Southern California doesn't have its sophisticates and its thinkers as well, but
Right.
I feel like in some ways, at least in terms of stuff that's pushing boundaries, maybe the crowd in Southern California might not be quite as receptive. I don't know.
My other thought was that maybe like the people that didn't agree in New York just sort of shook their head and walked away.
Oh, okay.
And I wonder if maybe it was just like a format scenario where like, Medium is like a pretty like not laid back, but there's a lot more, it's a lot more conversational in that like, and I'm glad it's this way, no one goes to a lecture and feels uncomfortable voicing their thoughts or their questions or opinions after the lecture is over.
Yeah. Oh, Medium's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I wonder if that has something to do with it as well, where like at Medium, it's very much like a conversation venue, such that okay, I talk, I give my lecture, and then the suggestion, and I mean, there's literally an entire section of each lecture built for questions. where there's like a discussion that's meant to occur.
Hmm.
Um, but I also think that, yeah, there's probably a significant difference. I and I said this in Medium, I think a lot of people misunderstand my like worldview as an affront to their own, and I really don't feel that way.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, no, you have to admit it is sort of a provocative topic, right? This
well,
idea
yeah,
that I mean, it's definitely stuck with me that the one verbatim line that I'm sure for everybody at that presentation really sticks out is this idea that the sublime can only be experienced through technology. It's a very, I mean, that's definitely something that's gonna push buttons, right?
of course, of course.
Yeah. And then I think too, I mean, I'm sure this must play into it because I definitely sort of got this feeling from from some of the way that the comments were directed at you, how they were phrased at Medium. But you're what, like 22?
Yeah, I'm 22.
Yeah, and I imagine that a lot of the pushback that you're going to get on stuff like that is going to be from people who are older than you. I think there's a certain amount of condescension there.
Yeah, I sort of sensed a little bit of that. I think a lot of any reflection that I had in that way came after the fact when I
Hmm.
was like replaying the recording that I made of my lecture. 'Cause in the moment, I don't know, maybe it's just that I'm not geared to respond that way, but I just like at no point felt like I was being attacked. And I guess I don't really think even now that I was, but
I don't know. I think there were one or two people at least who who felt a little attacking.
maybe I think at most it felt kind of it's funny. We're like both sad for each other. I felt it was kind of a bummer that the one woman I didn't meet her, so I don't know her name, but she described my worldview as sad, and I was kind of upset about that. Not angry. I was just kind of bummed out. I was like, that sucks. Like,
Yeah, but I think one of the things that comes out of it is that you know, I think what am I trying to say? There, as you get older, the way that you see things often becomes sort of crystallized,
yeah,
and and my whole life I've been seeing, think pieces and stuff about the new generation and times are changing so fast, and to some degree that's sort of like a universal thing about human experience. I'm told that even the ancient Greeks were writing about the kids these days, but
yeah,
but I think what it is not so much, when someone says, I mean, I remember that comment that you got. I know that woman. She's a friend of mine. So
hmm
I definitely I don't want to say anything, about her because I think she's great. But I think that that when you see something challenging and you're sort of invested in yourself. I mean, everybody's going to be invested in themselves. I think that this sadness is in some ways not even really, it can come across as condescending towards you,
hmm
but I think that it's really almost more sadness for oneself, you know,
yeah,
because it's like here's a thing that that mattered to me, that this is the way I see the world, and it kind of looks like maybe in the future people won't experience things that way, and it's not that that's sad for them because they don't necessarily know it any differently, but it's sad for me because this is something that that won't be there for me in the future. I don't know. It's
yeah.
something I'm not really sure exactly how to get my arms around that. You know?
I think another part of that is and I am definitely, I mean, you can ask my girlfriend, this is something that I struggle with is like, and I think this is like a human thing in general, but the first couple times, especially with music, and that's where it like drives my girlfriend crazy because she'll show me a song and I'll be like, nah, I don't really like that. And then someone else will come along and show me that song and it'll warm on me. And I think, and it becomes a problem with her because for very fair and obvious reasons, like you only like music that other people show you. I showed you that song a month ago. And what it really is that I I've had a month to let it sort of like sit with me and sort
Hmm.
of grow on me.
Yeah.
And I think that's true just in general for like things, you know. There's artwork, there's anything and everything that I might see once or twice and, you know, sort of brush aside and go, no, I don't like that. That's weird. That's not interesting or whatever, depending on what it is. And then, you know, you look at it a second time and you're kind of like, okay, I feel like I'm starting to get a sense of why someone might like this. And then eventually maybe you arrive at a point where you do like it. I mean, there's always going to be things you don't like, but I, I've like, this is a lifelong struggle for me, but I've been slowly trying to get better at like not being that way so that when I see something or I experience something, I don't have to like wait 4 days to decide I liked it.
Hmm.
But I think that might be part of that idea, you know, you see something and it makes you sad, but you know, maybe in 5 days she went back to it and revisited and she was kind of like, you know, that doesn't make me as sad as I thought it did
Hmm.
because, you know, just like letting it sort of stew in your mind. I wonder if, you know, because things definitely change for me over time. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure that's true for everyone else as
Yeah.
well.
I got to say, my wife and I have the same argument about music, except in the other direction, where it's me saying, "Hey, this is so great," and she's like, "Okay," but then when she hears it on the radio later, then of course. But I think you're right. It is often a question of just sort of warming up to things. You know, with your work in particular, I think there's sort of this is true. I think for a lot of visual art, but yours in particular, that you can experience it in just a purely visual way, and the concept of your work is present in the images, but it's not necessarily obvious. A
Hmm.
lot of the pictures that you have are, you know, particularly the one that you lead with the folded paper.
Yeah.
You know, are things that you can. It would be possible to sort of just take that in as a visual thing and say that's really pretty. I can like that on just that level. But I think what's difficult about your work is the concept itself, is the statement, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I was just looking at your website this morning before we talked that you don't have your project your artist statements attached to your projects on your site.
Hmm.
Is there Was that purposeful or just
You know, I'm not sure. It's kind of a toss-up, really. I mean, now we're talking like website craft, but if you go to like, I mean, pick just any 10 artists you like, and I mean, do they have websites? Because if they're like super, super famous, they may not, just
right?
because they're like, they don't need one.
Right.
But if you find 10 artists that you really like and they all have websites, I'd be curious to hear the numbers on like, you know, how many do have statements and how many don't. And I think it was just a decision I made early on because I've had a website long enough that like it predates that artist statement,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly enough.
Right.
And so obviously at the time there was nothing to put on the website. And so I just never really put it on. I'm not against putting it on there. I mean, now that you've said it, I'll probably think about it for like 3 days and then make a decision as to whether I should or not. But I think part of it is also that like you can find my words on my website through like the CV, and I need to redo this because I'm not sure everyone notices this, but almost at least half of the like lines on my CV on my website are actually links
Mm-hmm.
to the page that they come from.
Right.
So, you know, if you go down into like the contributions and publications, it's like basically a list of interviews that you can click and read. And so in a lot of ways, my artist statement is online. It's just not directly on my website.
Right.
So
Right.
but I can't say that I've like actively decided that I'm absolutely not putting it on my website. It was just like it's just something that sort of happened naturally, so to speak.
Yeah. And I guess too, there's always sort of it's one of those things I think for a lot of artists, certainly I go through this, where you want to, you don't want to, you sort of want to strike a balance between, you don't want to explain things too much, but you also don't necessarily want things to be too obscure.
Right.
Yeah. I was just, like I said, I was just looking through those images again, and the one that really I think is the one that's definitely stuck in my mind from your presentation back in October was the one through the truck window of the virtual deer.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
now correct me if I can't remember if I'm recalling this right, but you shot that it's a screen capture of a game, but you shot it with a 4x5. Is that right?
Y yeah, so it's not, I mean, if you consider the 4x5 as the screen capture tool, it is a screenshot, but it's not like I didn't make a screenshot and then like with the 4x5 photograph the static image, if that
No, no,
makes
no,
sense.
no. Yeah, that's what I understood. Well, the thing,
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of an odd choice to use such an old-fashioned and slow tool. I mean, that's the big thing about large format that everyone always talks about how slow the process is, and
Yeah.
and using that as your tool to capture something that's, I mean, the whole thing about that image is that it's such a fleeting moment, and that you're able to. Does that make sense? That's
Yeah.
that. It's one of those things. I kind of have trouble wrapping my head around it almost, you know?
Yeah.
But what was the choice? What's inherent in your decision to use something like a large format camera for something like that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. When I first started shooting large format, I'm like not that you couldn't tell, but I'm like an incredibly romantic person
Hmm.
in a lot of senses. I mean, including in regard to photography. And so, I picked up photography in high school, and then I transferred high schools so that I could learn darkroom photography. And then I got to college, and then it was like, oh, by the way, there's bigger cameras than 35 millimeter, and I just slowly started shooting with larger and larger formats. And when I got to 4x5, I really kind of fell in love with it.
Hmm.
And that's maybe not the answer that you're supposed to give, but
No.
um, so I mean that sort of predates any, conceptual reason, but now, like in the context of this project, it really does pay, homage to the history that I'm tapping off of, this history of, landscape survey photography and exploratory photography. I mean, a lot of that happened at a time where the most advanced photography or photographic technology rather was, sort of some version of large format.
Hmm.
So there's that element to it, and then there's also like I said, I mean, I don't know how else to put this. It's just something that, it's like if I already loved photography, and I did because, it got me through my angsty, teen years,
Hmm.
and, for a lot of people, myself included, it's incredibly cathartic to make photographs. Large format is like that on steroids because I mean, it's both extremely more complicated and also exceptionally more simple because it really is just a box with light inside of it.
Right. Right.
Um, so, if the question is like, do I shoot my computer screen with a DSLR or 4x5, the answer is going to be 4x5 for all of those reasons. And then also like, a lot of technical reasons, for example, that a 4 by 5 negative prints much larger and with much more resolution that I can get out of the DSLR that I can currently afford.
Right.
So there's a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. It's just so striking to have sort of wrapped up in the same project. Here's a project that you have that is really in many ways about the future and about it's about technology, but not just technology. It's about the technological advancement and about how we as a people are how our interactions with technology are progressing along with technology, but then the tool that you use to actually implement this conceptual project is really old fashioned. It's kind
Hmm.
of a striking juxtaposition.
Yeah. Uh,
So, well, go ahead.
no, no, no. Nothing. Continue.
I do think it's a really interesting notion. I've been sort of mulling over your talk ever since Medium.
Hmm.
This idea of technological mediation and how we experience things like landscape. I think that you're really onto something. I think the trouble that I have, or that probably most people would have, is just in the phrasing that it can only be experienced that way. But I think even there, I said this to you at the time. There's a sort of clarity of analysis here that, especially for people who don't necessarily live in these, if you don't live in a cabin looking out at the Grand Tetons, that
Yeah,
that this is
which I don't.
right. Neither do I. That this
I
is,
wish.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I guess I think the difficulty that people have is you get sort of attached to certain modes of experience the longer that you live, and and this idea that someone else might have a different way of experiencing the world that is just as powerful for them, but that doesn't include your mode of experience, can feel threatening, maybe.
Yeah. And what I find kind of interesting about that is that or I don't know, maybe that's not the right phrasing, but I go out into the world, I don't just sit at my computer, and I think what it really comes down to for me is that all these different kinds of experience that, I'm literally photographing and showing you, or like all the different kinds of experience that you can have in the world. I'm just trying to level the playing field in some sense. It's not so much that um, the statement is, pretty provocative, but really what it means from my position is that, like, even if you are in the terrestrial world and you happen upon a landscape, for me and the way that I experience the world, there is an amount of technology that has influenced my experience of that place and my arrival at that place, and et cetera, et cetera. So, um, a great example of that is, like, very early on in high school. I would just go out with my DSLR and I'd, you know, just walk around my neighborhood, or, for up until like a couple months ago, I didn't have a car. So if I could borrow my mom's car, I'd be out driving, or I would be walking or biking. And at a certain point, you feel a little bit like you've exhausted your surroundings. So I started getting on Google Earth and looking at, a top-down satellite image of the sort of immediate landscape around me, which is basically suburbs, and trying to find places that I thought might be interesting to go and photograph. And
Hmm.
it turns out that there's this weird field near my house, um, that I don't even remember what it is. I think it's like a letter or a number that they've cut grass out of the earth to reveal dirt in the shape of, for example, like the number 4.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember if that's what it was, but I remember seeing that and being like, that's so interesting. And it was like a mile from my house. So I got on my bike and, I'd quickly looked at Google Earth and been like, okay, because this is before I would have had a smartphone, which I don't even know if they would have had smartphones with navigation at this point,
No,
because that's relatively new.
yeah, you're talking about 7, 8 years ago. That I don't think that was a thing back then.
Yeah, yeah. So, I generally look at Google Earth and I go, okay, I need to take a left there, and then I'm going to be over on, Ballas or whatever road it is. And so I think I made like 4 or 5 attempts to get over there and got lost all but the last time, obviously, because then I would have found it. But I mean, even in the process of like getting lost, I ended up finding things that I thought were worth photographing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is sort of like, this is in my mind on par with, the conversation that like an atheist and a believer might have, where like, random occurrence is either influenced by nothing or by God. But, I would argue that technology has everything to do with all of those places that I went, even if they weren't the one I was trying to get to, you know?
Yeah.
So, but eventually I did find it, and there was like this really intense, interesting moment where it was not even worth photographing. I mean, it was obviously interesting because from the sky you could see what it was, but when you're on the ground, it just looked like grass and dirt.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I got there and I was like, this is so dumb. Like, why did I do this? But in hindsight, I'm like, I'm so glad that I felt the need to do those things, and I try to still do things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like the background on my computer right now is a place that it's in like Italy, I think. Actually, I know it's in Italy. I shouldn't say that like that. And so now I'm like dead set, like I need to find this exact location and then re-photograph this amazing photograph that it was on like some list of, like one of those like clickbaity lists that you see of like 10
like
great
10
landscapes
places you need to see before you die kind of thing.
Yeah. So but I was really struck by it. So I made it my background. But now I'm like, I need to go find that place and then re-photograph it.
Yeah. But I mean, and that is sort of, I mean, that really gets at sort of the heart of what your project is talking about, in that, how many people, living wherever they live, somebody who lives in Ohio or New York who may have never been to the West Coast, for example, have only experienced Yosemite through the work of Ansel Adams, and that's the only thing that they know of it. And especially in particular with Ansel's work, where every photograph, I mean, even he was doing stuff that it's not obvious to the layperson, but using filters and things like that over his camera lens to sort of heighten the drama, and being able to pick exactly the right day, because he was a park ranger, so he was able to just go. He was able to see exactly the changing conditions and know this is going to be a good photograph.
Right.
But how many people you say maybe they save up their whole life and they are able to finally come out, go to Yosemite, see El Capitan, see Half Dome, and maybe they're there on a shitty day where it's just a really hazy, or the sun is too harsh or something, and it's not going to look like what the photograph looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the really interesting thing is that when you then take that experience in their memory of it, when they finally go home, what their memory is going to be of that experience is inevitably still going to have been influenced by Ansel Adams' photographs. That whatever significance they had attached to it before they ever even got there is still going to be part of their physical experience of having been in that terrain. And I don't think that's something that very many people, certainly not people that I know that are my age and older, I don't think that is something that people have thought a lot about.
Yeah, and that's a conversation that comes up a lot, and I actually really enjoy it. I think the primary difference between, when Ansel Adams was, contemporary, so to speak, and now is that at the time, the person making and, manipulating the photograph the way Ansel Adams was, so Ansel and then like his colleagues, no one knew, or I guess it was less normal for you to know what was going on in the darkroom when they were manipulating it.
Hmm.
But now we have, things like Photoshop where even if you don't use Photoshop, you understand the idea of changing the nature of an image through technological means.
Hmm.
And so really nothing has changed. And that's a fact. I mean, we agree on that. The problem comes with that now people are more aware of how you would go about manipulating an image. And that's where things get really complicated. And it's actually a really frustrating point for a lot of people because, myself included, because you'll have conversations or you'll overhear conversations where someone will say, oh, well, that image is photoshopped. And depending on your definition of, quote, photoshopped, you could say, and you would be right to say that every single image on my website is photoshopped
Sure.
because it has passed through Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
I haven't moved pixels around, I haven't made composites. I haven't changed the nature of the image, but, are there curve layers and are there, masks and local adjustments? Yeah, of course. But
Yeah.
that's no different from what was happening in the darkroom. And so,
But even at that,
because,
like,
no, go ahead.
so what? So what if? I mean, for your particular project, it wouldn't be appropriate to do that kind of heavy editing, compositing and things like that. But I mean, other people do, right?
Of course.
Maggie Taylor, for example, is a master of that kind of thing, and what she does is brilliant.
Hmm.
What I think it's interesting hearing you talk about. There's a sort of the fundamental thing about photography that sets it apart from other visual media is this idea of indexicality
Hmm.
that I don't probably don't need to explain this to you, but just for myself, if I can say this out loud, that whatever it is that is in the photograph is something at some point has some relationship to something physical that was in front of the lens.
Yeah, the suggestion is that it's one to one.
Right.
It's not that it just has some relationship. It is that it is the thing itself.
Right. And I think that people don't really have. It's interesting, when you're talking about, oh, everybody, people will say, oh, that was photoshopped, and I mean, there's even whole, websites, Photoshop fails that are just all about that.
Yeah.
But, but, but at the same time, so people on one hand may be less trusting of images of photographs than they might have been in the past. At the same time, I think there's still sort of this implicit, sort of unquestioned relationship that people have with photographs, where there is still this sort of implicit trust that they have in that,
Yeah.
and that they don't really think about it too deeply.
And that just makes things even more complicated,
Hmm.
because you have a contingency of people who, go around, and that makes it sound like it's a bad thing. It's really more of just a fact. People go around saying that things are photoshopped or that this is real or this is fake, and yet simultaneously, like, suggest an amount of doubt towards the medium, and then simultaneously also trust it incredibly.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, it's just like it's so complicated. It it's I don't know. It's hard to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and then especially with projects like yours, where you are using an analog camera to capture images that are generated digitally, that just
Yeah,
throws a whole nother layer on it.
yeah. But I'm not, and maybe the website isn't the best medium to really see this, but I'm not trying to trick you or hide anything from you because, I mean, if you look closely in the deer photo, for example, you can see the computer screen
Oh,
pixels,
absolutely. Yeah.
and so there, I would like to believe, and maybe there isn't, but I would like to believe that there's a level of transparency in my images where I'm not, I'm not tricking you, or at least I'm not trying to. It's more like I want you to negotiate the relationships that are occurring between different sources and different kinds of images that I'm like, juxtaposing between each other.
Yeah. I don't think it's really a question so much of whether you're misleading anyone with your images. Rather, if someone is going to come to your images and say, oh, well, this was photoshopped or not, like
Yeah.
the question of what is and isn't real. I mean, this is actually kind of a central question to your whole project.
Yeah. Which is kind of convenient that, people would proceed to have that conversation in a meta way. You know, I I've been thinking about this because it keeps appearing because I get on Reddit too often, and I'm reluctantly subscribed to the photography subreddit. There are a bunch of people all up in arms right now because Nikon had this photo contest or whatever, and this guy made a photograph looking up through, like a ladder that has sort of like a protective shell around it, and it's just like little like steel bars that go around it. So it's like, I don't know, visually, I guess a nice looking photo of, this like tunnel that's looking straight up. And the guy photoshopped in an airplane, and kind of poorly at that. And he didn't, I don't know. I mean, maybe this sounds snobby, but he didn't even really like delete out the background of the photo from the airplane.
Right.
So there's literally a white box around the airplane. And that photo actually won the contest through Nikon. So there's like a whole slew of questions that proceed from that, like, how did Nikon not catch this? And then you have all the purists who are like pissed that, they can't even believe that this guy won. And then they're getting even more angry when the guy who won puts out, some kind of quote press release where he says that he's sorry and that he facetiously told them that he saw the airplane. And it's like, it's really interesting to look at from the outside because I don't know. I mean, on one hand, I don't really have a dog in that fight, and so I'm really just more interested in seeing the way people react to it. But in a weird way, I almost want to like fight for the guy. I want to be like, he made an image that was striking and Nikon shows it. Even if it wasn't real, it could be real. There is a ladder somewhere that if you look straight up at 4:37, 16 seconds on March 18th, the airplane will be there. He just chose to, make the image because he didn't want to wait.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is something I've said to a bunch of people over the years, but I think photography in particular, I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think it may have something to do with the fact that the way that photography is understood and used in non-artistic ways, but is sort of an inherently conservative medium, and people tend to it attracts people with a sort of conservative mindset. The idea that manipulation in an artistic sense would somehow be a no-no. I mean, I don't know what the rules of that contest were, so whether or not that contest was supposed to allow that kind of thing is up to the organizers of that contest, whatever.
Yeah.
But like this idea that in an artistic context that any kind of manipulation would be out of bounds is sort of ludicrous.
Right.
There's been a whole other thing. I don't know if this is something that you have followed at all, but in the journalism world, photojournalism world, the past year or so has been all over the place. The whole internet seems like has been shouting about different images that have won contests that have had, what is an acceptable level of
right.
of manipulation.
No, I know what you're talking about. And what I was going to say about the Nikon contest is that my guess is that it's being held to similar standards to those kinds of projects that you're talking about, or not projects, but contests.
Yeah.
like the journalistic standards of I think the language that they use is like, I think it is, that you haven't changed the nature of the image, but what's interesting is that there are manipulations that I've made to photographs in like This World and Others Like It, for example, that don't fit into their regulations. Their regulations are incredibly strict, and there are like some instances where I don't feel sympathy. There was the one where the guy edited out a cameraman. I don't know if you saw that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he knew the rules. And there were a lot of people that were upset that his image got, stripped of its award. But the reality is that there was a set number of rules and that he broke them.
Yeah.
We can argue whether or not the rules are fair, but I mean, imagery in that regard in journalism and slightly more, what's the right word? Like when you're using an image in that context, or in a context like if you're going to show a criminal on the news and like what picture do you show, and like those kinds of contexts, the gray area seems so much bigger. I just feel like there shouldn't or isn't a gray area with art, but with that stuff, it gets so much more complicated.
Yeah. I think for me what it comes down to is like certainly organizations, whether they are setting rules for a competition or for how you're allowed to submit for a journalistic piece, that's their right to do that, and if you want to be included in that game, you have to follow those rules. That's not controversial to me, but I think for me, what the issue is really has to do with the way that people understand images, and that this idea that there is any way to have a photograph that represents fact unadulterated that's a highly problematic statement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because even just in selecting what you're going to show in the frame, even if you were shooting it on film and just didn't do any just contact printed everything, just the fact that you're putting a border around some slice of the world, some slice of time in the world, that's a manipulation right there.
Yeah, and there are so many like cheeky and serious examples of that. There's like, you can go to Pizza Hut and look out the window and see the pyramids. Like, that's kind of hilarious. But then like a more serious example is like, and I'm not sure that I've seen anyone do it as well, but like when Terrence Simon did The Innocence, especially in her TED Talk, she talks about how in one example, can you hear that?
Oh, a little bit, yeah.
Well, we have to make sure we're safe, I guess. Anyways,
What is that?
the test for like tornado
Oh.
and that kind of thing, Oh man, this is totally unrelated. I've always wanted to like get a little bit better at videography and get like a nice video camera, or more importantly, just like a nice microphone. And it would take years to compile enough video for this to be interesting, but only go out when that alarm is going off and make really mundane video of like people walking. I don't know. That always really interested me. Anyways, so she talks about a couple specific instances from The Innocence where like, here's this guy who, he's in a lineup and the victim couldn't make a correct match. She was like, none of these people quite look right. That guy kind of looks like the guy who attacked me, but the guy that attacked me was younger. So then a week passes, or some amount of time passes, and then they show her a lineup of photographs. And they went and they found a photograph of that man from 3 years earlier. And she made a correct identification off of that photograph. And what she talks about is that, the photograph replaces your memory if there ever was one in the first place.
Right, right.
And
Yeah.
it's just like she just hits the nail on the head with that bit of her talking at TED, because it's exactly what we're talking about, and it's also like an incredibly dangerous and scary place for that reality to be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
Because the entire project is people who were wrongfully convicted for crimes that they didn't convict or commit, rather.
Right, right. So, for the second segment, I ask my guests to bring a topic of their own choice, and the topic that you chose was video games. I think that is a very fertile ground for
Yeah.
discussion. Well, why don't you start us off and see where you want to go with this?
Well, I guess the thing I've been thinking about all since I like sort of suggested or pitched that to you was like, well, I guess it's just going to be an hour about my work because I mean, like the deer photos from a video game.
Right.
But there are like a few things I've been thinking about. Two things in particular. And one of them isn't so related to video games. But I guess I should preface this a little bit. So, like, the primary way that I actually experience video games is through YouTube videos, which I'm sure will only make it harder to identify with me as a 22-year-old for some people.
Some people,
Like,
sure.
yeah, they're like, he doesn't even play the video games, he just watches them.
Yeah, there've definitely been conversations around my office where the younger guys try to explain Twitch TV to the older guys, and there's a lot of befuddled looks that happen on the older faces.
Yeah, and he starts a little bit later than I usually go to bed, but if he starts early, there's a guy that I watch any night that I'm awake and not busy on Twitch, and he plays one of the games that I was going to mention, but just like that medium in general, like watching things online, randomly brought me to this video. This was maybe like a couple months back, and I didn't know the YouTuber. It turns out this YouTuber has like 1.5 million subscribers, I think. And I think the most he does with video games, I'm not entirely sure why YouTube even fed the video to me, but I think the most he does is he plays FIFA. But in any case, he had this video where he was like, it was when he hit 1 million subscribers. And when you hit 1 million, I mean, are you familiar with like the YouTube buttons that they give you?
Not really, no.
Oh, okay. Well, those are like super cool, and maybe they're just cool because I'm invested in the culture. But in any case, when you get, I think it's when you hit 100,000, and then when you hit 1 million, it's kind of like when an album goes platinum. So they give you a YouTube button that's platinum. It's not actually platinum, I don't think. But in any case, so he hits 1 million and he wants to thank his subscribers. And so what he does is he goes on an online chat room type situation. I think it was Omegle, which is like less shady chat roulette.
Okay.
And so basically with this like chat service, you can basically go on, and the way he set it up was you can put interests into a little box, and it only pairs you with people that are interested in that same thing. So he basically came up with a unique string for everyone to type into that section that was like, I'm a big fan of, and I think his YouTube channel is KSI. He's kind of an annoying person, quite frankly. But that's what that almost like further reinforces my argument here, if there is one at all. Is I've since subscribed to him, and I hate most of his videos. He's just like, yeah, I don't. We won't go there, but he's kind of a chauvinist. In any case, so he puts out this video, and basically what this video is it's him looking back on a handful of the conversations that he proceeded to have with these people on this online chat room. And because he has 1 million subscribers, it would be ludicrous to actually have like a meetup in an actual place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because thousands of people would probably show up. So instead, he does the chat room thing, and so basically, it's like chat roulette where you just like randomly get paired with someone. The only
Right.
difference is, like I said, you only get paired with people that are interested in it. So theoretically, KSI, this YouTuber, is only getting paired with people who want to chat with him.
Right.
And I cried watching this video because what happens is you're sitting there and you're just like clicking new person, new person, new person, hoping and praying that you'll like get KSI.
Mm-hmm.
And on KSI's end, the video that he puts out is only him getting paired with people because he's the one that everyone's trying to get paired with. So the general progression of every single conversation that he had was people losing their minds, right? They're like, you have 1 million subscribers. How did I get in contact with you? This is crazy. And, so they're slowly getting through the shock. And then a good majority of the people, and maybe it was just like the people he chose, but I'm going to ignore that for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
They freak out, and then at a certain point, they just break down. And it's like funny, but also incredible because basically what happens is here are these people who like desperately want to talk to this guy
Mm-hmm.
because in some way or another, he positively influenced their life. In a way that makes them incredibly happy. And, there's always going to be people who are, grappling with things like depression. And so those people come out of the woodwork and are like, you saved my life. And
Mm-hmm.
they're weeping. And now I'm weeping.
Yeah.
And it was like one of those moments where, one, it was an intense experience for me to watch the video. But in hindsight, reflecting on it, I was like, this right here is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a way more intense version of what I'm talking about, but it's the exact thing I'm talking about. Here are these people who have never met this guy, but he has influenced the way that they experience the world around them.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, that's like a much more like cheesy and uplifting version of the story, but it's still the same exact kind of thing.
Yeah. I think this is sort of, people always sort of hoped this was the promise of the internet, to be able to bring people together in these ways and build communities.
Yeah.
I think the degree to which games facilitate that is probably not something that people who don't understand video games, I think they would be surprised by that.
Yeah.
Especially because so much of what you hear about games and game culture, it has to do with, Gamergate and misogyny and the ways that the community breaks down.
Right.
Sort of the dark side of that.
Yeah.
But even outside the context of games, I've had, friendships and relationships with people online that have lasted years that I have still never met them in person. It sort of gets to the point where you say I think you said, they've never met this guy. But it's like at some point it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is like me saying that has something to do with the culture surrounding it that I'm almost sort of arguing against. But, really, if I'm being honest, I don't see them as being all that different. And I have like similar versions of that where like there are people online that I've never met, but I've interacted with on several occasions. Who's to say that I don't know them? I don't know them as well as I could, but that's really just a product of the fact that we don't interact very often.
Yeah. And even at that, how often do you necessarily, interact really deeply with, I don't know, your coworkers, the people you go to school with, even people in your family? There are going to be blind spots. How well you know someone, can really have very little to do with, the frequency of your interactions.
Definitely.
It's one thing that I've, and in particular, with online gaming, I think that there is something to this idea that being engaged in an activity together, whether it's competitive or cooperative, can sort of lend a certain intimacy to the interaction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
And even this sort of gets at when you talk about this guy on YouTube and people flipping out. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because I listen to a ton of podcasts, and you do sort of develop a relationship with the people that you listen to, week in and week out. Even if it's a one-sided relationship, it can be something that's very important and meaningful. These people are in a very real way a part of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's sort of a bad example for me of that, just because, like I said, I don't really like him. But that video, that video was the first thing I ever saw of his, so I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have any like preconceived notion going into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, my like the people I'm subscribed to on YouTube is longer than can be shown on my computer screen.
Right.
Do I watch all of their videos? Absolutely not. Don't get the wrong idea here. Uh, I also don't watch all of the videos from the people that I do like, but
There's only
for
so many
example,
hours in the day.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I tell people, and this is true, but it's useful to make sure that I disclose it because it eases people's minds a little bit. I typically put it on as background noise
Mm-hmm.
and work on my other computer monitor. So I'm not just, handing myself over to YouTube videos all day. I mean, there are the videos that I like and enjoy enough that that's what I do, but
Mm-hmm.
most of the time I'm like multitasking. But in any case, I mean, there's one guy in particular that I'm subscribed to. He's from like Florida, I believe, but he a while back moved to Bulgaria with his wife because his wife is from Bulgaria and his wife's mother got cancer and his wife's mother wanted to be with her family in Bulgaria as she fought the disease.
Mm.
Why do I know any of that?
Yeah.
It's because he shared it with me and I cared to remember because I enjoy his content,
Right.
So this guy knows nothing about me, but if I ever met him, I felt like I could have a decent conversation with him. Like how's your your mother-in-law? How's she been? Is
Yeah.
she doing okay? It the level of information that you have about these people, it's just really interesting. It's like you said, it's very one-sided, but it's also very meaningful. And in a lot of indirect ways, some of the things that I've gotten from these different people that I follow have absolutely influenced not just the way that I like navigate the world, but also the way my work looks and the way that I talk about my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely an element of cross-pollination that happens.
Yeah.
You're going to take in information from any way that it's presented to you. And there's something about, especially when it comes to something like YouTube, YouTube having this sort of very personal culture, this sort of casualness to it, as opposed to, other platforms that may feel a little more produced.
Yeah.
That there's something that sort of casualness it brings the intimacy to a different level, where it really does feel like a person, even if they don't know you.
Yeah. I mean, there are people that I follow that because they play video games, there's no need to show their face. Like, there are people that I follow that no one has ever seen what they look like because they've never disclosed that information.
Mm-hmm.
But I know quite a bit about these people. I know, like, the one I'm thinking of in particular, I know he doesn't like bananas. It's like, why do I know that? Well,
Yeah.
he's mentioned it a couple times. I don't know what he looks like, but then I know like this other weird, random, semi-intimate information about this guy.
Yeah. 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 It's sort of weird.
I think another part of it, and this was the other thing that I was thinking of when I sort of, I guess, pitched video games, is So I also think there's a contingency of people who go, okay, fine, like, there are experiences that can be had through video games and through these relationships that you develop online. But there's still an otherness involved where like, well, yeah, okay, here are these experiences you're having, but they're not going to be as intense or as meaningful or powerful as the ones you might have in the real world. And this is a little bit different, but there's this video game that is perpetually in development. I think it's still in beta. Who knows when it will come out for real? But it's this game called DayZ.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the thing about DayZ is that the map is incredibly large. And so the odds of running into a person are like sort of low. They're not incredibly low. I mean, there's pockets of contact where people tend to go to come in contact with people, but in general, the likelihood of running into another person is lower than most games.
Mm-hmm.
It's not Call of Duty where you respawn and 3 seconds later you're shooting at someone again.
Right.
So, and then the other thing about DayZ worth noting is that when you die, when you come back in the game, you come back with nothing.
Right.
So you have to build from nothing every single time.
Right.
And so the one thing that DayZ has done incredibly well is it's forced you to either get so upset and angry that you never play the game again, or you develop a value for that contact, and it manifests itself in incredibly real ways. Like I don't play it very often just because I don't have a whole lot of time, but when I do, I'm not very good at letting go of the gear that I accumulate as I play the game.
Right.
And so if you hear a gunshot in the distance or you hear a door open nearby or you have some sense that there's someone near you, my heart starts pounding and the level of adrenaline is so incredibly high. It almost makes me want to like, it doesn't feel like it should be that intense, but it's a great example of something that has successfully influenced me in physical, tangible ways that is undeniable. Like I was playing a couple nights ago and I was sweating. I was sweating and my heart was pounding because I was so scared that I was going to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like kind of absurd, but it's also like really real.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
that's my actual heart, that's my actual perspiration. It's not like my house is hot. In fact, it's kind of cold, because we don't turn the heat on very often, right? So I,
When you talk about that, I mean, this is really getting at sort of the function of art. And I think that sort of the condescension that can happen about games is because they are such a new medium that the types of experiences that they have, people associate it with childhood, with, because most of us that came up with games like me, it was something that we did when we were kids. And they may not have stuck with the medium long enough to see where it's gone. But I mean, there's something about this that even gets back to Aristotle in some way that, he talks about in, his definition of tragedy being, I can't remember the exact words anymore. This was back in high school that we read this stuff, but it was like, that it's a thing that you are watching through which you receive these heightened emotions and through that you're able to have this cathartic moment so that you almost don't have to have those emotions in your real life, that you're able to experience them vicariously through the art, and have them valuably but safely. And that's very similar to the kind of thing that you're talking about now. I don't know how many people talk about Aristotle in the same conversation about DayZ, but
not enough.
Yeah, it's funny. I can never help thinking about the late Roger Ebert famously took to Twitter at one point on a tirade about how games will never be art. I remember specifically this one time he was saying, okay, maybe someday they'll be art, but we know this for sure that no gamer who is currently living will ever live long enough to see them become art. Which just to me was just such a it was such a I Ebert could say any number of insightful things about movies, and I loved the way that he wrote about movies, and even though just the way he wrote about life. But it's funny, the sort of blind spots that people can have about these things, as though the kinds of experiences that you can have in this medium are not just as valuable as ones that you can have, through movies or through books or through paintings or anything like that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with the timeline that you exist on. And so the thing that I always cite is that like the internet existed before I did. And so all these different kinds of media and ways to experience through screens and through my eyes in general. And in fact, if you start at the eyes, there's, in my mind, really no difference between a screen and the real world in a lot of ways, because they both end up passing through the same sort of physical reality of like my eyes. That's how I see things.
Mm-hmm.
All of those different kinds of medium, they've all grown up with me in parallel and in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
And so where other people didn't have them and then they had them, and so there was like this capacity to create an othering effect where, well, this is new and different. I've never really had that because I've never not had a lot of these things.
Yeah. Yep.
There are like interesting things where I sort of feel like I see where people are coming from, where like new technology will come out, and maybe this is more just a me thing and less a what we're talking about kind of thing, but like curved TVs, I find them really uninteresting and, for lack of a better word, kind of dumb.
Well, not
Like,
everything ends up sticking.
yeah, it's a lot of things I see that are like newer technologies, they feel incredibly novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the way that some people see some of the things that I take very seriously. And so I sort of feel like maybe I'm getting a small hint of the way that people might understand some of the things that I enjoy. But I also have never felt, I think I said this earlier, but I've never felt like really angry at anyone for disagreeing with me. It
Sure.
almost feels more like an exciting notion. And I won't name names, but the one thing that makes me really happy, and maybe this is too self-indulgent, but the one thing that makes me really happy about like the resulting conversation that happened at Medium, or the conversations that result because some of the things I say are a little bit provocative. I find that space that we then occupy, where we're like discussing and arguing, incredibly exciting and really fun. And I won't name names, like I said, but there are other artists whose work is just inherently good and inherently exciting. And the resulting conversation after the fact is really kind of dull because none of us know what to say. We're all just like, okay, yeah, this is really amazing. And we can all agree that this is phenomenal. It's phenomenal technically, conceptually, everything about it is amazing. But other than how did you do this one thing, what am I supposed to ask you when I agree with everything that you're doing? You know?
Yeah.
And that's like really, that's a really hard and complicated space for me to like navigate, because I undeniably love certain bodies of work. But at the same time, I get a little bit sad because I almost wish there was like a contingency of people that hated that person's work that I could go to and discuss and like, sort of have a meaningful conversation where two people disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times, the deeper understanding is going to come out of conflict.
Yeah.
and even just being able to understand your own opinion, sometimes the easiest way to do that is if you have to try to defend it to someone else.
Yeah. This is like tangentially related maybe, but I watched YouTube for a while. I think has had this thing where it was like hashtag YouTube asks Obama, and I watched a video, one of the newer ones they put out, and something Obama said was like, whenever we're dealing with something, I always do my best to put people who know more about the problem than I do in the room, and then I also make sure that there's a contingency of people who disagree with that person in the room at the same time. And it was like kind of this small thing that he mentioned, but I feel like the ramifications are incredibly high, because what he was really saying is that like he wants to see every side of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that gets back to what you just said, where it's like, and I agree absolutely, that some of the more meaningful critiques that I've had, for example, have been when there's been a contingency of my classmates or my colleagues that either didn't like my work or didn't agree with some of the things I was saying, because the resulting conversation had a heightened intensity, because people were really sort of fighting for their position.
Right. Right. Well, I think that you are off to a great start, and I think that, I hope you get to continue having those great conversations over the course of your career. I think that you are going to go places, so I hope I'm right anyway.
Thank you. I hope you're right as well.
Anyway, so thanks so much for sitting down and talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great fun.
Thanks. Do you have anything that you wanted to plug or anything like that?
No plugs right now. I would have a plug if it were a month and a half from now, so maybe people should check up on me in a month and a half, but
okay.
I can't say anything yet. So.
Okay, well, we'll make sure and check back in a month and a half.
Great.
All right. So there we are, my conversation with Drew Nikonowicz. I recorded that conversation about 2 weeks ago, so be on the lookout for some news from him next month. If you want to keep current with him, you can follow him on Twitter at NikonowicD. That's NikonowicZD. He's also on Tumblr at nikonowicz.tumblr.com. And I'll be sure to share any news I hear from the show's social media accounts. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can find me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at Keep the Channel Open, or send me email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. Next week, I'll be talking with photographer Samantha Jabal. That's a really good one, so stay tuned. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.